The wagon didn't slow down when it crossed onto Thornland. That was the first thing Alara noticed. Not the cold, not the dark pressing down from every direction like a weight she couldn't push off. Not even the outline of the ranch house materializing through the curtain of white. It was the speed. The driver, a reed-thin man named Aldous, who'd said maybe 11 words to her in 6 hours, didn't pull the reins or call out to the horse or do anything to signal that they were arriving somewhere. He just let the animal find its own way to the barn like it had done this 100 times before and didn't need any ceremony to remind it where home was. Alara didn't have that. She hadn't had that for a long time. She shifted on the bench, her fingers numb inside her gloves, her mother's gloves, the only thing she'd grabbed before her uncle had loaded her bag onto the wagon that morning and told her to stop looking at him like that. She'd asked what she was supposed to look like, and he'd said nothing, just turned away. She'd watched the back of his coat until the house disappeared into the gray December morning. And then she'd faced forward and hadn't looked back since because there was nothing worth looking at. That was 6 hours ago. Now there was just snow and dark and the smell of pine resin and smoke coming from somewhere ahead, and the wagon finally slowing as the shape of a house became real. It was a big house. That surprised her. She'd built up a picture in her mind on the drive, something cramped and half-rotted, a structure that matched the transaction she'd been part of, but the house that emerged from the storm was solid. 2 stories. A wraparound porch half buried in drifts. Lamplight in 2 of the downstairs windows, yellow and steady. Somebody was home. Somebody was awake. She didn't know yet if that was a good thing. Aldous pulled the horse to a stop in front of the porch steps and climbed down without a word, looping the reins around the post with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent his whole life ending journeys like this. He didn't offer her a hand. She climbed down herself, her boots hitting the packed snow with a sound that felt too loud, and she straightened up and looked at the house and tried to feel something useful. The front door opened before she made it to the first step. The man in the doorway wasn't what she expected either. She'd expected old. Her uncle had described Caleb Thorne as a rancher, alone with 3 children, looking for household help, which in the language her uncle spoke meant looking for someone he could pay less than a hired hand and expect more from. She'd pictured someone weathered down to the bone. Someone with gray in his hair and a stoop to his shoulders, and the general shape of a man who'd already used up most of his life and needed someone young to carry the rest of it. Caleb Thorne was not old. He was maybe 34, 35, broad across the shoulders in a way that made the doorframe seem smaller than it was. Dark hair, badly cut, like he'd done it himself in a hurry and hadn't given it much thought. His face was the face of a man who'd spent years in weather, lines around the eyes, the particular kind of tan that came from working outdoors through every season. He was holding a lamp in one hand, and his expression, when he looked at her, was completely unreadable. Not cold, not warm, just absent. Like he was seeing a problem and calculating how to solve it rather than looking at a person. She'd seen that look before. "You're Quinn's niece," he said. It wasn't a question. "Alara," she said. "Alara Quinn." He nodded once. "Caleb Thorne, come inside." He turned and walked back in, and she understood she was supposed to follow, so she followed, and Aldous carried her bag up the porch steps and set it inside the door and touched the brim of his hat at no one in particular and left. Just like that. The door closed behind her, and she was inside, in the warmth. And the warmth was such a shock after the cold that for a moment she couldn't focus on anything else. Then she could. The main room was large by frontier standards. A kitchen along one wall, a fireplace taking up most of another, a long table with benches, chairs pushed against the walls, a staircase in the corner. It was clean, not orderly. There was a boot near the hearth that didn't have its pair, a child's drawing pinned crookedly to the wall beside the window, a stack of papers on the table that had been moved aside to make room for something and never moved back. But it was clean. Someone cared about this house, or had once. Standing at the base of the stairs were 3 children. The oldest was a boy, maybe 12 or 13, with his father's dark hair and an expression that made it clear he'd already decided something about her before she'd opened her mouth, arms crossed, jaw set. He looked at her the way a watchdog looks at a stranger, not with aggression exactly, but with the very firm intention of aggression if she turned out to deserve it. Behind him was a girl, maybe 9 or 10, with a long braid over one shoulder and wide, cautious eyes. She wasn't hostile. She was frightened. There was a difference, and Alara had learned early in life how to read it. And at the back, half hidden behind the older two, was a little one. 4, maybe 5. A boy with a round face and bare feet on the cold floor and something clutched tight in his hand. A carved wooden horse, she realized. He was staring at her with pure, uncomplicated curiosity, which was more than she was getting from the other two. "These are my children," Caleb said, from somewhere to her left. He said it the same way he'd said everything else so far, direct, uninflected, like he was reading from a ledger. "Will, my eldest, Nora, and the youngest is Daniel. You'll be responsible for the household, meals, cleaning, the children when I'm out on the property. There's a room at the back of the house." Alara looked at the 3 children. Will said nothing. His arms stayed crossed. Nora's fingers found the end of her braid and started working it. Daniel held up the wooden horse. "Do you like horses?" he asked. "I do," Alara said. He considered this very seriously, then dropped his arm. "Okay," he said. That was her welcome. She didn't sleep well that first night. The room at the back of the house was small. A bed, a chest, a window that looked out on the side of the barn. There was a quilt folded at the foot of the bed that was thick enough to keep her warm, and she was grateful for it in a blunt, practical way, the same way she'd been grateful for things her whole life. Not with surprise, just with acknowledgement. The cold was real. The quilt was there. Those two facts dealt with each other. What she couldn't sleep through was the sound of the house. It wasn't that it was loud. It was the opposite. It was the particular quiet of a house that used to have more noise in it and hadn't figured out how to fill the space. She'd heard that quiet before, in the year after her mother died, when she'd walk through rooms and feel the absence of sound like a presence of its own. Something had happened in this house, something that had taken someone out of it and left a shape behind. She'd find out. She always found out. But for now, she lay in the dark and listened to the wind against the window and thought about her uncle's face when he'd told her. She'd been washing dishes. He'd come into the kitchen and stood there with his hat in his hands, which meant he'd already made the decision and was working up to telling her, because that was how he operated. He decided things and then spent time building the nerve to say them. And he'd said that he'd spoken to a man named Thorne, a widower, a good man, a rancher up near the territory's North Ridge, and that he'd arranged for Alara to go and help with the household. She'd kept washing the dishes. "Help with the household," she'd said. "It's a good situation," he'd said. "Better than here." She'd turned around then. She'd looked at him for a long time. He hadn't quite met her eyes. "How much?" she'd said. His jaw had worked. "That's not... It's a fair arrangement." "How much, Uncle Harold?" He'd told her. $40. She turned back to the dishes. Her hands were shaking, but she'd kept washing. There wasn't anything else to do. She was 18 years old, she had $4 to her name, and the man who was supposed to be her family had just told her what she was worth to him. 4, maybe 5 days later, the wagon had come. She'd packed her bag herself. Morning on the Thorne Ranch came before she was ready for it. She heard the sounds start before dawn, the low of cattle somewhere distant, the creak of the house settling in the cold, and then, unmistakably, the sound of a child's feet on the stairs. She was dressed by the time the knock came at her door, which was soft enough that she almost missed it. She opened the door to find Daniel, still in his nightclothes, the wooden horse in his hand. "It's morning," he informed her. "It is," she agreed. "Papa makes eggs," he said, "but he burns them." She looked at him. He looked at her with the complete seriousness of someone who has lived long enough to identify a solvable problem. "Does he?" she said. "Every time," Daniel said. "Will says don't say anything because it makes Papa feel bad. But they're burned." She held out her hand. He looked at it, then took it, and together they walked to the kitchen. The kitchen, in daylight, was a better room than she'd been able to see the night before. It had good windows, south-facing, which meant sun in the morning. And the stove was well-maintained, iron that had been scrubbed and kept. There were herbs hanging from a hook near the door, dry now, but still holding their smell. Someone had put thought into this kitchen once. Someone had cooked in it with intention. She was kneeling in front of the stove, checking the flue, when Caleb walked in. He stopped in the doorway. She stood. "I can make breakfast," she said. "If that's—" She hesitated because she didn't know what the rules were yet, which things she was allowed to do and which things were claims she wasn't supposed to make. "If that's all right." He looked at her for a moment, then at Daniel, who was sitting at the table with the horse, making it walk along the edge. "There's a smokehouse out back," Caleb said. "I can bring in some sausage." "I can use what's here," she said. "If that's all right," she said again. Something moved in his face, not quite an expression, but the possibility of one. He nodded once and went back out through the side door, and she heard his boots on the porch stairs heading to the barn. She found eggs, good ones, and salt, and a half block of butter that was harder than she'd have liked in this cold. She found a skillet that had been well used and well cared for. She got the stove going properly and started the eggs, and she'd just flipped them when she heard Will on the stairs, his step heavier and more deliberate than his brother's. He came around the corner and stopped when he saw her at the stove. "Where's my father?" he said. "Barn," she said. "Breakfast is nearly ready." He stood there. He was taller than she'd realized the night before, long-limbed, still in the process of growing into himself. He had his father's eyes, but his mother's coloring, she thought, fairer skin, lighter build. He was watching her at the stove with an expression that was very careful and very controlled. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Your father went out to work," she said. "Somebody needed to." "We managed before you got here." She turned to look at him. He met her eyes without flinching, which she respected even though he was doing it to challenge her. "I didn't say you didn't," she said. A beat of silence. "The eggs are going to burn if I don't watch them," she said, and turned back to the stove. He didn't leave. He got himself a cup and filled it from the pot she'd already set to heating, and he sat at the end of the table and said nothing else, which wasn't warmth, not by any measure, but it wasn't war either. She'd take it. But Nora came down last, after her brothers, and stood in the kitchen door with her braid undone and her hair loose around her shoulders, and looked at the plate of eggs on the table with an expression that tried very hard to be neutral and mostly succeeded. "You can sit," Alara told her. Nora sat. She picked up her fork. She did not say thank you, but she did eat every bit of what was on her plate, which was its own kind of answer. Caleb came in from the barn as she was putting the skillet back on the hook, stamping snow off his boots, and stood at the edge of the kitchen and looked at his children eating at the table and at the clean dishes in the rack and at the pot of coffee still hot on the stove. Alara set a plate on the table for him and went to get her own. He sat down and picked up his fork, and she sat at the far end of the bench because she'd noticed there was a particular order to where everyone sat, and she didn't want to displace it, and for a little while the only sounds were the fire in the stove and silverware on plates and Daniel making very quiet horse sounds under his breath. Then Caleb said, "These aren't burned." "No," she said. He looked up at her across the table. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite name. It wasn't gratitude exactly, and it wasn't quite surprise either. It was something like adjustment, like a man recalibrating a measurement he'd taken wrong. She looked down at her plate. "My mother used to put salt in before," Nora said suddenly. Her voice was small but definite. "In the eggs, before she beat them." Silence fell over the table. Alara kept her face still. "That's the right way to do it," she said. "It makes them fluffier." Nora looked at her plate. "Yes," she said, "it does." Nobody else said anything, but the silence was different after that. Less tight, more like the ordinary quiet of people eating and thinking about their own things. Alara ate her eggs. She didn't ask about the mother. She would let them tell her, if and when they wanted to. She knew how those things worked. You couldn't pull that kind of grief out of people by asking questions. It had to come on its own time, at its own pace, the way frost comes off a window in morning light. Not all at once, and not because you did anything to make it happen. Tatab. She learned the shape of the day over the next week. Caleb was gone before full light most mornings, out to the herd with a hired man named Pete, who was taciturn to the point of invisibility. He came in for the midday meal if he was working close to the house, and always for supper, and in the evenings he sat at the table with papers and accounts, and sometimes the children came to him, and sometimes they didn't, and Alara couldn't always tell which he preferred. He did not talk to her much, not rudely. There was nothing unkind in the way he dealt with her. It was more like he'd drawn a circle around the parts of his life that were operational: the ranch, the children's welfare, the running of the household. And inside that circle, they communicated clearly and with efficiency. And outside it, there was just the wall. She respected the wall. She had enough things to do without trying to get through it. Will helped her the most, which was ironic because he was the one who'd stared at her like a threat on the first night. But he was also the oldest, and the oldest child always knows where things are, where the extra blankets live, which board on the porch steps is loose, which cow gives the most trouble. He told her these things grudgingly and without warmth, but he told her, and she listened carefully and didn't thank him effusively because she could tell that would irritate him. Nora stayed watchful. She was the kind of child who processed everything at a remove. You could see it in the way she stood slightly back from whatever was happening, taking it in, not ready yet to decide what it meant. She let Alara braid her hair on the fourth morning, which was not nothing. She said nothing about it either way, but she sat still while Alara did it, which was its own kind of permission. Daniel was simply easy. He followed her around with the wooden horse and asked questions she couldn't always answer. Why is the sky that color? What do birds eat in winter? Do horses get cold the same as people? And she answered what she could and said she didn't know to the rest, and he accepted this as reasonable. The neighbors were another matter. The nearest homestead was the Grafton place, 3 miles down the eastern track, and its owner, a square-bodied woman named Mrs. Grafton, with a face like cured leather and opinions like nails, had come calling on the 5th day with a preserved apple cake and eyes that wanted to see everything. Alara had let her in and made tea and sat across from her and answered the questions that were answerable and smiled at the ones that weren't. "So, Harold Quinn's niece," Mrs. Grafton had said. She said it like she was verifying a species. "Sent you up, did he?" "I came to help with the household," Alara said. Mrs. Grafton's eyes moved around the kitchen like she was taking inventory. She said. "Well, he needs someone, that's for certain. After Ruth—" She stopped, made a sound that wasn't quite clearing her throat. "After what happened, those children needed stability." "They seem like good children," Alara said. "They are," Mrs. Grafton said, with a firmness that made it clear she felt proprietary about this opinion. "Will's steady, Nora's smart as a whip, takes after her mother in that. And Daniel—" Something softened in her face for just a moment before she locked it down again. "Daniel's all right. He was too small to understand what happened. That's a mercy." Alara sat with her tea. She didn't ask. Mrs. Grafton looked at her. "Ruth passed going on 2 years now," she said finally, with the air of someone who has decided that the information will cause less trouble out than in. "Fever. Took her in under a week. Caleb was out on the far pasture, and by the time he got back—" She stopped again. "Well, it was a hard winter." Alara looked out the window at the snow. "It was," she said. "Ochut." She understood after that why the house felt the way it felt. Not haunted. That was too dramatic a word for it, and besides, she didn't believe in that kind of thing. But populated by an absence. Every room had been arranged by someone who was no longer there to use it, and everything in it was still in the shape of that someone's hand. The herbs on the hook in the kitchen, the way the furniture faced the fire, the quilt on the bed that Alara was sleeping in, which was made with a particular kind of small, precise stitch that told you everything about the woman who'd sewn it. She was careful, in the house. She moved things as little as possible. When she rearranged the kitchen for her own working, because she needed to, because you can't cook efficiently in someone else's logic. She did it quietly, and she did it with the smallest possible footprint. And if anything had to be moved, she thought about where it belonged before she touched it. Will noticed. Of course he did. He didn't say anything. But one afternoon, when she was on her knees scrubbing the hearthstones, he came and stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at the arrangement of the kitchen and then at her, and she waited for him to say something, and he didn't. He just nodded, once, very slightly, and went back upstairs. She counted that as the first real thing. It was the end of the second week when Caleb spoke to her at length for the first time. She'd been up late. Daniel had had a cough, and she'd sat with him until he'd fallen back asleep, which had taken an hour. And when she came out into the main room, she found Caleb still at the table with his accounts. He looked up when she came in, which she hadn't expected. "Is he all right?" he said. "Yes, just the cold air getting to him, I think. He's sleeping." Caleb looked down at his papers, then back up. Sit down, he said. She sat. He was quiet for a moment. He had a way of pausing before he spoke that she'd noticed. Not hesitation, not uncertainty, but deliberateness, like he checked what he was going to say before he said it. You've been here 2 weeks, he said. Yes. It's not... He stopped, tried again. I want you to know that I'm aware of what kind of arrangement this is, what Harold told you about it, and what the reality of it is. I don't... Another stop. He looked like a man who'd gotten good at avoiding a certain kind of conversation. The children need consistency. That's why you're here. That's the arrangement. But I want you to know you'll be treated fairly. You'll have Sundays. You'll see... I know, she said. He looked at her. I'm not... She started carefully. I'm not under any illusions about what this is. I'm not angry about it. I'm just here. He held her gaze. His eyes were the kind of gray-brown that changed depending on the light, and in the lamplight they were dark. Your uncle. I'd rather not talk about my uncle, she said. A beat. All right, he said. She looked down at the table. The wood was old but good. White oak, she thought, the grain still tight. Someone had made this table to last. Your wife made the quilt, she said. She didn't know why she said it. Maybe because she'd been holding it for 2 weeks and it had gotten heavy. Caleb was very still for a moment. Yes, he said. It's good work, she said. The stitching. He said nothing. She got up. I'll let you finish, she said. Good night. She went back to her room. Behind her, the lamp at the table stayed lit for a long time. Top. December deepened and the cold got serious. This was not frontier winter in a story cold, the kind that makes everything look picturesque and silver. This was actual cold, the kind that cracked the wood in the walls and froze the pump handle and kept the livestock restless and meant that every morning started with an hour's worth of necessary work before anything else could happen. She learned to sleep with her boots near the bed so they didn't freeze. She learned the particular sound the stove made when it was getting too hot versus not hot enough. She learned that Nora slept with the window cracked a 1/4 inch, regardless of temperature, which explained why Nora always had a faint pink in her cheeks, and that Will was the one who made sure Daniel's boots were laced before school on the days they could get to it, even though he'd never admitted to doing it, and she'd never mentioned that she'd noticed. She learned that Caleb Thorne worked the way some men pray, constantly and without expecting any reward but the work itself. He was out in all weather. He came in at the end of the day with the kind of exhaustion that came from using your body until it had nothing left, and he ate, and he checked the children's lessons, and he sat with his accounts, and then he slept and did it again. There was something both admirable and terrible about it, like watching a man hold himself together with pure mechanics because he didn't trust anything else to do it. She didn't try to get past the wall. She kept the house. She fed the children. She helped with lessons when they'd let her, which Nora started to do first, and Will eventually followed because he had a pride that was different from stubbornness. He'd resist on principle, but he wouldn't suffer a wrong answer to prove a point. The community around the ranch was small and had opinions about everything. She heard some of them through Mrs. Grafton, who came by roughly once a week and whose loyalty she was gradually earning through the medium of very good pie crust. She heard others when she went into the supply town with Caleb in the 3rd week, a trip that involved a lot of people finding reasons to walk past the wagon and look at her. She looked back. They weren't unkind, mostly, just curious. A woman named Elora Quinn who'd appeared in the middle of a blizzard to keep Thorne's house. That was interesting, by small settlement standards. They were measuring her against something she couldn't quite see but could feel, the shape of a woman who'd lived here before her and left an impression in everything. She didn't compete with it. She didn't try to replace it. She was just herself, which was all she'd ever been able to manage. It was the last week of December when things shifted, and the thing that shifted them was small. She'd been darning socks at the table after supper. The children had gone up, Caleb was at his accounts, and without planning to, she started humming. She didn't realize she was doing it for a while. It was something her mother used to sing, a working song, nothing with words in it, just a melody that had a particular quality of moving forward through things. She stopped when she became aware of it, but by then Nora had come back downstairs. She was standing at the bottom of the steps in her nightgown, barefoot, looking at Alara with an expression that was careful and open at the same time, the look of a child deciding whether to be brave. My mother sang sometimes, she said. Alara kept her hands on the sock she was mending. A lot of mothers do, she said carefully. Nora didn't come further into the room, but she didn't go back upstairs either. She just stood there holding onto the newel post and said, "It didn't sound the same, what you were humming." "No," Alara said. "It wouldn't." Nora thought about that. "But it wasn't bad," she said. "Okay," Alara said. Nora went back upstairs. Alara sat at the table for a moment after she was gone. Then she picked up the sock and went back to work. She was still at it when Caleb looked up from his papers and said, without preamble, "She hasn't talked about her mother to anyone in 6 months." Alara kept her eyes on the darning needle. "She wasn't talking to me," she said. "She was just saying something out loud." Caleb was quiet. "That's different," Alara said. "Sometimes you need to be able to say a thing out loud without it being a conversation." He didn't respond to that, but he didn't look back at his papers right away either. He sat there for a moment with his hands flat on the table and looked at the empty staircase, and Alara looked at her work, and neither of them said anything else. The lamp burned down between them. Outside, the snow had stopped for once, and through the kitchen window the sky was doing something she hadn't seen since she got here. Clearing, slowly, stars appearing at the edges where the clouds had thinned. Not warmth, not a thaw. Just a pause in the cold, a moment of something that was almost like rest. She tied off the darn, set the sock aside, and stood up to bank the fire for the night. "Good night, Mr. Thorne," she said. "Good night, Miss Quinn," he said. She went to her room. She lay down on the bed with the quilt over her and looked at the ceiling in the dark, and thought about the fact that she had been here 3 weeks, and she had not been broken, and she had not run, and she had not, against everything she'd expected, been nothing. She had made the eggs right. She had held Daniel through a cough. She had given Nora a place to say one true thing. She had learned which board on the porch was loose, and she had put a wedge under it so nobody would trip. These were small things. She knew they were small things. But she was beginning to understand that this place would only give way to small things, one at a time, offered without demand. And if she had patience enough to keep offering them, if she could find that kind of patience in herself, something might eventually grow out of it. She didn't know yet what that would look like. But she was 18 years old, and she was still standing, and the quilt on her bed was warm, and for tonight, that was enough. The stars held outside her window. The ranch was quiet, and Alara Quinn, who had been sold into a frozen future with $40 and a bag she'd packed herself, closed her eyes and did not dream of going home. Because she had started, slowly and without meaning to wonder if home might be something you had to build from scratch. January came in hard, not the dramatic kind of hard that made for good stories, not a blizzard that knocked the whole territory sideways and gave everyone something to talk about later. Just the grinding, relentless kind. Day after day of cold that didn't break, gray sky sitting low over the ridge, the ground frozen so deep that the cattle had to be moved closer to the barn, and the men worked twice as long for half the result. It wore on everything. The house creaked at night like it was protesting. The children came inside from any outdoor errand red-faced and short-tempered, and even Daniel, who was generally the most resilient creature on the property, started spending his afternoons pressed against the window, watching the yard with an expression that on someone older would have been called despair. Alara learned to read the cold through the house. She learned when to add wood before anyone asked. She learned that Nora's hands cracked badly if she didn't oil them every few days, and that the girl would not do it herself and would not ask, would just let them crack and bleed and not mention it. The first time Alara brought the tin of tallow to the table and set it down in front of her without comment, Nora looked at it for a long moment, then looked up at Alara, and then quietly reached for it. That was all. No thank you, no acknowledgement, but the next day and the day after, the tin was on Nora's nightstand. These were the kinds of conversations they were having, the kind without words. Will remained the harder case. He was not cruel. She'd revised that early assessment, because cruelty required a certain active investment, and Will didn't waste anything on her either direction. He was simply closed. He did his work around the house when she asked, and he did it adequately and with the mechanical efficiency of a boy who'd been keeping things running for longer than he should have had to. He ate what she cooked. He answered questions directly. He just never offered anything. She didn't push. She had understood something about Will in the first 2 weeks, that he was the one who'd held things together after his mother died. and that holding things together had required him to stop being a child, and that he wasn't entirely sure he knew how to be one again, or whether he was supposed to. She could see it in the way he watched his father. There was something between them that wasn't quite tension and wasn't quite closeness. Something like two people who had survived the same thing at the same time and were still deciding what that meant. Caleb didn't talk about it. She didn't expect him to. What she noticed was that her presence in the house had changed the quality of the evenings. Before, she gathered this from small things, from the way the children described the weeks before she arrived, from what Mrs. Grafton let slip, from what she could read in the arrangement of the rooms. The nights had been quiet in a flat, empty way. Caleb at his accounts. The children upstairs or nearby, but apart from him, each in their own orbit. Now there was at least the sound of the kitchen being used, the smell of something warm. Daniel had started bringing his wooden horse to the table after supper and conducting elaborate one-sided conversations with it while Ilara finished up the washing, which was its own kind of noise and its own kind of life. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was more than what had been there before. She told herself this on the hard days when she scrubbed the floor in the cold and her back ached and Will walked past without speaking, and she thought about $40 and a handshake and her uncle's face turned away. She told herself she was building something even when it didn't feel like building, even when it just felt like maintenance. She was good at maintenance. She'd been doing it her whole life. The neighbors complicated things in the way neighbors always do, by caring just enough to be intrusive. Mrs. Grafton was the primary agent of this. She was not a bad woman. Ilara had come to understand that there was genuine feeling behind the leather exterior, a real concern for the Thorne children, a real protectiveness over the memory of Ruth Thorne, and a real uncertainty about what Ilara represented in the ecology of this grief. Which was reasonable. Ilara had some uncertainty about that herself. What Mrs. Grafton could not help was her tendency to talk, and talking led to the other women of the settlement knowing things, and knowing things led to opinions, and opinions eventually made their way back to the ranch. It was Pete, the hired man, who accidentally delivered the first one. He'd come into the kitchen for water one afternoon in the second week of January and found Ilara there and stood drinking his cup with the stiff discomfort of a man who had not wanted to find anyone in this room and was now uncertain what to do about it. He finished the water, set the cup down, started for the door. Then he stopped. "You know people are saying things," he said to the wall rather than to her. She'd been dicing carrots. She kept dicing. "I imagine they are," she said. Pete looked at his hat brim, saying the arrangement is not proper. A young woman in the house with... He stopped, started again. "People talk. People talk everywhere," she said. "What are they saying specifically?" He shifted his weight. He was not a man who liked specifics. Just that, what it looks like. You being here. The situation. She set down the knife. She turned around and looked at him levelly. Pete was somewhere around 50, with a face that had forgotten how to be uncomfortable a long time ago, except that right now it clearly hadn't. He was looking at a point slightly to the left of her shoulder. "The situation," she said, "is that there are 3 children who need a hot meal and a clean house, and someone to make sure Daniel doesn't sleep with the window open in January. That's the situation. Is there a different situation I should know about?" Pete opened his mouth and closed it. "If Mr. Thorne has concerns about how things look, he can tell me himself," she said. "If the neighbors have concerns, they can come tell me themselves. I'll be here." Pete put his hat back on his head. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went out. She turned back to the carrots. Her hands, she noticed, were very steady. Caleb found out about the talk, about Pete's visit, the same week. She didn't know how. Maybe Pete told him. Maybe Mrs. Grafton's various supply lines carried it to him. Either way, he came to find her on a Friday afternoon while she was in the cold yard hanging laundry, which was a miserable task in January, but the alternative was damp washing on all the chairs. And he stood on the edge of the porch with his arms crossed and watched her for a moment before he spoke. "I heard Pete talk to you," he said. She clipped a shirt to the line. "He did." "What he said?" "It's all right," she said. "It's not all right," he said, with a firmness that surprised her. "What people are saying is..." He stopped. She glanced over her shoulder and found him looking at the far ridge with the expression he got when he was working something out. "It's not fair to you. None of this is particularly fair to you." She turned back to the laundry. The wind was cutting hard off the ridge and the wet sheets were already stiffening. "No," she said. "It's not." "I can speak to Mrs. Grafton." "Don't," she said. Then, more evenly, "Don't, please. It'll make it worse. It'll make it look like you're managing something that needs managing. Let it sit. People run out of things to say eventually." A pause. "You have a lot of experience with people saying things about you," he said. She almost laughed. It came out as something else, a short exhale through her nose that wasn't quite either. "I've been poor and plain and female my whole life," she said. "Yes, I have some experience." The wind moved between them. The sheet on the line knocked against the rope. He said, "I'll make sure it's known that this household is properly run." "Mr. Thorne," she said. "Caleb," he said. She stopped with a clothespin between her fingers. He said it the same way he said everything, directly, without preamble, but it still landed differently than she'd expected. "Caleb," she said, "I just—" He unfolded his arms, put his hands in his coat pockets. He looked for a moment like a man who wasn't sure which way to step. "It's not what I wanted for this situation. When I arranged it, I want you to know that." She looked at the sheet on the line for a moment. The wool coat on her back that was 2 sizes too big because it had been her uncle's, and she'd taken it because it was warmer. The clothespin going cold in her fingers. "I believe you," she said. And she did, which surprised her a little. He nodded. He went back inside. She went back to the laundry. But something had shifted in the way the house sat around her after that. Something small and structural, like a door that had been slightly off its hinges for weeks and had finally been lifted and set right. It wasn't fixed, not by a long stretch, but it was something. The 3rd week of January was when Nora let her in. It happened the way most things happened in that house. Sideways, not head-on. Alara had found a box of sewing supplies in the chest at the foot of the bed in the room that had been, she understood now, Ruth Thorne's workroom, before it had been turned to other things. She'd brought the box to the kitchen table and was sorting through it, looking for thread she could use to mend the tear in Daniel's coat, when Nora appeared from wherever she'd been and stood looking at the box with an expression that was very still. "That was my mother's," Nora said. "I know," Alara said. "I needed thread. There's a tear in Daniel's coat." Nora sat down across from her. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the contents of the box. Spools of thread in a range of colors, needles wrapped in a strip of felt, a small pair of scissors with handles shaped like a bird. She reached out and touched the scissors without picking them up. She liked nice things, Nora said. Not expensive things. She just liked things to be made well. "I can see that," Alara said. "She made that quilt in your room," Nora said. "Will's, too. She made a lot of the curtains." She paused. "She was teaching me to do smocking. I was bad at it." "Smocking's hard," Alara said. "I know," Nora said. A pause. "She said I'd get better." Alara found the color of thread she needed and set the box aside carefully. She threaded the needle and turned Daniel's coat over to find the tear. "Could you show me?" Nora said. Alara looked up. "The smocking," Nora said. She wasn't looking at her. She was looking at the bird scissors. "If you know how—" Alara kept her voice level. "I know a little," she said. "My grandmother taught me. I'm not very skilled at it." "That's okay," Nora said. They sat at the kitchen table for the rest of that afternoon, Alara stitching Daniel's coat, while Nora found a piece of practice cloth from the bottom of the box, and they worked through the basic stitch together, Alara explaining what she remembered, and Nora's hands moving with an early cautious precision that would become something real if she kept at it. They didn't talk much. There was music in the task itself, the pull of thread through cloth, the quiet in the house around them, the light coming flat and cold through the south windows. It was not healing. Alara was clear-eyed enough not to call it that. Healing took longer and looked different and wasn't done in one afternoon at a kitchen table. But it was a door cracked, and that was enough to work with. Will broke differently. Harder and faster when it finally happened, the way certain kinds of ice break. Not gradually, but all at once, with a sound. It was a Tuesday, and she'd been helping Daniel with his letters at the table, which Daniel found both necessary and deeply unfair. and Will had come in from outside with the look of someone who'd been avoiding the house for a while and had run out of reasons to stay away. He stood in the doorway, stamping mud off his boots, and when he looked up and saw her at the table, his face did its usual careful closing. Then Daniel held up his paper. "Look what I wrote," he said. Alara helped. Will looked at the paper. He looked at it for a moment too long, which was how she knew something was happening. "That's a backwards E," Will said. Daniel looked at his paper. "I know," he said, unconcerned. "Alara says backwards is still a letter. You just have to decide which way it's going." Will looked at her. She met his eyes and waited. "That's not how letters work," he said. "He's 5, she said. "I'm almost 6, Daniel corrected. Will stood there in the doorway in his coat, with mud on his boots, and looked at his brother, and at the crooked letters on the paper, and at something else she couldn't quite identify. Something internal, something that was working itself through a knot it had been caught in for a while. "Fine," he said finally. "Fine what?" Daniel said. "Fine. It's a good E," Will said, and went upstairs. She looked down at the table. She was very careful not to smile. Later that evening, after supper, Will came and stood near her while she was cleaning up, which was new. He didn't offer to help. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, which was its own kind of communication. Then, "You're not leaving," he said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was more like a statement that wanted to be confirmed. She set down the dish she was drying. "Not planning to," she said. He was quiet. "I know you thought I would," she said. "The first few weeks." He looked at the counter. His jaw moved a little, the way it did when he was chewing on something. "Lots of people don't stay," he said. "After..." He didn't finish it. "After your mother," she said. He nodded. "Who didn't stay?" she asked. "The woman who came in the fall, Mrs. Heller. She stayed 3 weeks. He picked up a spoon from the drying rack and turned it over in his hands. "Before her there was someone Pete's wife found. She lasted longer, but He put the spoon down. "It doesn't matter. They left because it was hard," she said. Not accusatorily, just factually. "Everything is hard," Will said, with a bluntness that made her heart clench a little, because he was 12 and he'd already understood that, which wasn't a lesson a 12-year-old was supposed to have learned yet. "Yes," she said, "it is." He stood there another moment, then, "The stovepipe in the back room is getting loose. You should tell my father before it gets worse." "Thank you," she said. He went upstairs. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment after she heard his door, listening to the fire settle in the stove and the wind outside, thinking about what it meant to be trusted with practical information by a boy who had been deciding not to trust her for a month. It was the smallest possible form of welcome. It was also, she thought, the most honest form Will Thorne knew how to give. She told Caleb about the stovepipe the next morning. He got it fixed that same afternoon, and when Will came in from outside and saw it done, he glanced at Alara across the room, and she gave him the faintest nod, and he went to the table and sat down for supper without a word. That was how trust was built in that house, in stovepipes and backwards letters and bird-shaped scissors, not in declarations, not in grand gestures, in small, careful things offered and received without ceremony. Alara understood this. She was learning the language. But January still had more to say, and not all of it was in a language she was ready for. The night it happened, she was in the kitchen well after midnight. She'd gotten up to check the fire. It had been dropping temperatures all day, the kind of cold that pressed against the walls. And she was feeding wood to the stove when she heard it. A sound from upstairs, thin and particular. Not a nightmare sound, not a tumbling out of bed sound. Something different. A cough. She set down the wood. She heard it again. Then again. That particular pattern, deep, catching, the sound of something working wrong. She went upstairs. Daniel's room was at the end of the short hall, across from Will's, and when she pushed the door open, the lamplight showed her what she'd been afraid of. He was sitting up in bed, hunched forward, one small hand pressed flat against his chest, his face red in a way that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the heat that was already building in him. She crossed to the bed and put her hand to his forehead. Her stomach dropped. "Hey," she said, keeping her voice even. "Hey, Daniel, can you look at me?" He turned his face up to her. His eyes were glassy and too bright. My chest hurts, he said. His voice was hoarse. I know, she said. When did it start? When I was sleeping, he said. Like that was an unreasonable place for it to start. She heard a sound in the hall and looked up to find Will in the doorway, awake, taking in the scene with eyes that had snapped from sleep to alert like a switch had been thrown. How bad, he said. She looked at Daniel. She didn't want to say what she was thinking with him listening. Get your father, she said. Will disappeared. She stayed with her hand on Daniel's forehead and felt the fever pulsing under her palm like something alive and urgent. And she thought about what she knew, which wasn't much and wasn't nothing. She'd been sick herself as a child. She'd helped care for a neighbor's infant once, through a week of something that had looked like this. She knew about the wet cloth and the steam and the careful business of keeping a fever from climbing too far, and she knew that none of it was a cure and all of it mattered. Caleb came in fast. He was still in his shirt, no coat, and when he saw Daniel, his face went through 3 different things in about 2 seconds. Fear, and then the effort to push the fear down, and then the look that was left when the effort mostly succeeded, which was a tight, white, controlled expression that she recognized as the face of a man running on will and not much else. He sat on the edge of the bed. Daniel, his voice was steady. I'm here. My chest, Daniel said. I know, bud. He looked up at Alara. Fever, she said. It came up fast. I need the kettle and as many rags as you have, and I need to know if there's any of that pine tar salve Mrs. Grafton brought. In the medicine chest, he said. Top shelf? Get it, she said. He went. She turned back to Daniel and started pulling the extra blanket back to keep him from overheating, and the child looked at her with his 2 bright eyes and said, Is it bad? It's something we're going to deal with, she said. You're going to be fine. You don't know that, he said. 5 years old, she thought. 5 years old, and he already knows when people are saying things to make him feel better rather than because they're true. No, she said. I don't know that, but I know we're going to work very hard on it. He seemed to find this more satisfying. He sank back against the pillow. She worked through the rest of the night. It was not graceful work. It was the kind that leaves you sore for days after. Leaning over the bed, wringing out cloths, managing the steam from the kettle that she'd set up on the floor with a tent of cloth over Daniel's face to help loosen what was in his chest. It required a constant reassessment of temperature, of sound, of the particular quality of his breathing. Caleb stayed. She hadn't been sure he would. She'd half expected him to run from this room the way grief-damaged people sometimes ran from reminders of the thing they'd lost. But he stayed, and he was useful, which was better than she'd dared to hope. He brought what she asked for. He held Daniel still when the child got restless and unhappy. He changed the cloths when her arms were tired. He didn't give advice or push back on what she was doing. He just worked alongside her in the low lamplight, in the small hot room, and she was grateful for it in a way that had no language. At some point past 3 in the morning, Daniel fell asleep. Real sleep. Not the collapsed sleep of exhaustion, but something that looked more even. His breathing was still bad, but it had stopped worsening. Alara took that as a thing to stand on. She straightened up from the bed. Her back screamed. Caleb was in the chair by the wall. He'd pulled it from the corner at some point, and she hadn't noticed. His elbows were on his knees, and his face was in his hands, and he was very still. Caleb, she said. He looked up. His eyes were red at the rims, not from crying, from exhaustion and from the particular kind of strain that comes from holding yourself very tightly for a very long time. He's sleeping, she said. That's good. He looked at his son. His jaw worked. The last time, with Ruth, it came on fast like this, and then, I know, she said. This is not that. You don't, I know I can't promise, she said, but I can tell you that what I'm seeing is something a body can fight. He's strong. He's been healthy. We caught it early. She paused. I'm going to stay in here tonight. You should sleep. I'm not sleeping, he said. Then rest, she said. You can't be useful tomorrow if you're running on nothing. He looked at her for a moment. His face in the dim light was the face of a man who had been broken by something and had put himself back together and was afraid of breaking again. She could see the weld lines from here. You're very direct, he said. Yes, she said. I am. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the chair closer to the bed, leaned back in it, and closed his eyes. She settled onto the edge of the mattress beside Daniel, with her hand on the child's back to monitor his breathing, and she sat there in the dark and listened to the small sounds of the boy sleeping and the fire settling in the stove downstairs, and Caleb's breathing gradually slow in the chair. She didn't sleep. She kept watch. That was what the night required, and she was going to give it what it required. By dawn, the fever had broken enough to matter. Not gone. Fevers don't vanish between 1 hour and the next. But the sharp edge of it had come off, and Daniel woke briefly and asked for water with the ordinary demanding clarity of a child who feels bad, but not catastrophically bad. And she gave him water, and he went back to sleep. And she looked at Caleb across the bed, and he looked at her, and there was something in that exchange that she couldn't name and wasn't going to try to, because she was too tired to name anything, and names could wait. Will was in the hallway when she came out. He'd been there for some time, she thought. He was already dressed, and there were the signs of a boy who had stayed awake doing something useful in the dark, which in Will's case meant that she found when she went downstairs that the fire was already built up and the water was hot. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his arms folded. "How is he?" said. "Better," she said. "The fever broke." Something happened in Will's face. A controlled collapse. The same thing his father did, the held breath releasing at once. He looked down at the table. "Okay," he said. She sat down across from him. She was exhausted in every part of her body, and she thought she probably looked it. "You were up," she said. "Yes," he said. "You built the fire." "Somebody had to," he said, and the words sounded like Will, but the voice behind them was not as hard as it usually was. Something in it had come loose. "He's really okay?" "He's going to need a few days of rest and careful watching," she said. "But yes, he's okay." Will picked at the edge of the table with one thumbnail, a gesture so young she felt a small ache. "When my mother got sick," he said, not looking up, "we didn't know how bad it was. She said she was fine. She always said she was fine." He stopped. Alara didn't fill the silence. "I should have made her rest," Will said. "I was old enough to know something was wrong." "You were 10, she said. "I was old enough." She looked at him across the table, 12 years old, sitting on guilt that wasn't his to carry. "Will," she said, "listen to me." He looked up. "There is nothing a 10-year-old could have done," she said. "There is nothing anyone could have done. Fevers do what they do, and people do what they can, and sometimes it's not enough. That was not your fault. It was never your fault." He held her gaze. His eyes were Caleb's color, that shifting gray-brown, and they were very young and very tired, and he didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. She could see him receiving it, which was enough. "Get yourself some breakfast," she said. "I'm going to check on your brother, and then I'm going to sleep for approximately 1 year." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but closer to one than she'd ever seen from him. "There's oats," he said. "I can make them." "Please," she said. She went back upstairs. Caleb was still in the chair. He'd fallen asleep at some point, his head tilted back at an angle that was going to hurt when he woke up, and she stood in the doorway looking at him and at Daniel sleeping in the bed, and at the morning light just starting to come through the small window, thin and gray and honest, the way January light was. It didn't promise anything it wasn't delivering. She was 23 days into this. She had $40 and a bag she'd packed herself and a room at the back of a house that wasn't hers. But she was here, and she was standing, and downstairs a 12-year-old boy was making oats in the kitchen because she'd asked him to, and in the bed beside her, a 5-year-old was going to wake up this morning and ask for his wooden horse. And in the chair, a man who had been surviving on mechanics alone had finally fallen asleep in a room where the worst thing could have happened and hadn't. She went and straightened the chair under Caleb's head as carefully as she could, and then she went to her room and lay down on top of the quilt without taking her boots off and closed her eyes. She slept without dreaming. Outside, the January cold was still hard, and the ridge was still gray, and the cattle were still waiting in the close barn. But inside, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time had, in the hours since midnight, unclenched, just a little. It wasn't much. It was a great deal. Daniel's recovery was not a straight line. She'd known it wouldn't be. That was the thing about illness in children. It moved in surges and retreats, giving you a good day and then pulling it back, letting you think the worst was over and then reminding you that it got to decide when the worst was over, not you. The fever broke on that first morning and she'd let herself breathe, and then it climbed again that evening, not as high, but high enough, and she'd spent a second night in the chair by his bed doing the same slow, careful work of wet cloths and steam and keeping him still and calm when his body wanted to be neither. Caleb was there for the second night too. He didn't ask. He just appeared in the doorway around 10 o'clock with his coat off and his sleeves rolled and the look of a man who'd decided something and wasn't going to announce it. She moved the extra chair to the other side of the bed, and he sat down in it, and they kept watch together in the low light without talking much, which suited her. She wasn't in a place for conversation. She was in a place for attention, for listening to Daniel's breathing and tracking the heat under her hand and watching for the signs she'd learned to read over 2 nights of this. "You should have told me it came back up," Caleb said, around midnight. "You were sleeping," she said. "You needed it. That's not your call to make." She looked across the bed at him. He was watching her with something that wasn't quite anger. It was more territorial than that, more like someone who'd been told they'd missed something important and couldn't decide if they were grateful or not. "It was a degree higher," she said. "I had it. If it had gone further, I would have woken you. I'm not going to wake you for every fluctuation." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Daniel. "You're very sure of yourself," he said. "No," she said. "I'm very practiced at not looking unsure when it doesn't help anyone." He was quiet after that, and she couldn't tell if she'd said too much or if he was just turning it over. With Caleb, silence didn't tell you much. He was a man who thought before he spoke on a good day, and this wasn't a good day for either of them. By the third morning, Daniel was sitting up and demanding his wooden horse and complaining that his throat was sore, which were all signs she categorized as deeply encouraging. His color was better. His eyes had lost the terrible brightness of high fever and had gone back to their normal state, which was the unselfconscious sharpness of a child who noticed everything. He ate a small amount of broth. He asked 3 questions in a row about whether horses could catch fevers too, which meant he was well enough to be curious, which meant he was going to be all right. She let herself believe it by noon on the 3rd day. Nora brought Daniel's lunch up herself. She didn't ask, just appeared with the bowl balanced carefully on a small board and her face composed in a way that was doing a lot of work to look ordinary. She sat on the edge of her brother's bed and fed him the broth 1 slow spoonful at a time, and Daniel accepted this with the regal patience of a small boy who has discovered that being sick has certain social advantages. Elara stood in the doorway and watched them for a moment. "You don't have to stay," Nora said without looking up. "I've got him." She said it the same way Will stated things, as fact, not hostility. "I've got him," like it was just true and she wanted Elara to know it was true. "Okay," Elara said and went downstairs. She sat at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands for about 30 seconds, which was all she was going to allow herself. And then she got up and started on the afternoon's work, because work was the thing she knew how to do when everything else felt unsteady. Caleb found her there an hour later. He came in from outside with snow on his shoulders and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her like she was a problem he'd been working on all morning and had finally arrived at an answer for. "Sit down," he said. She turned from the counter. "I'm in the middle of Elara." Just her name. Nothing attached to it. She sat. He sat across from her. He had his hat in his hands, working the brim the way he did when he was going through something, and she let him go through it because she'd learned that you couldn't rush Caleb Thorne through a thought without getting the wrong version of it. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at the table. "What you did this week, the last 3 nights, I couldn't have—" He stopped. "The other women who came, Heller and the one before her, I don't think they would have—" He stopped again. She waited. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The arrangement we made was for the house, the cooking, the children's daily. It wasn't, you weren't obligated to." "He's 5 years old," she said. Caleb looked up. "He's 5 years old," she said again. "I don't need an obligation for that." He held her gaze. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way you could put into words, but it was there, a loosening, like something that had been braced against pressure had just felt the pressure change. "Thank you," he said. That was all. But the way he said it made it way more than it should have. She looked down at the table. "How are you?" she said. He blinked, like the question surprised him. "When Ruth was sick," she said carefully, "it moved fast. Mrs. Grafton told me. And this week with Daniel must have—" She didn't finish it. She let him fill the gap or not. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved across the roof. "The first night," he said, "when you came and got me, I went up those stairs and I saw him and I thought—" He stopped. His hands went still on the hat brim. "I thought not again. That was the whole thought. Not again. And then I—" A long pause. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there. I don't know that I would have known what to do." "You would have figured it out," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm glad I didn't have to." It was, she thought, the most he had ever said to her at one time. She got up and put the kettle on, because she needed to do something with her hands, and because he looked like a man who hadn't stopped moving long enough to be cold and could use something hot. "Pete's wife makes a compress with mustard powder," he said from behind her. "Ruth used to use it. I couldn't remember the proportions. 1 part mustard powder to 4 parts flour," she said. "Warm water, not hot. You don't want it too wet." "You knew that?" "My grandmother," she said. A pause. "She taught you a lot," he said. "She was the most competent person I've ever known," Elara said, "and she never said a kind word about anyone her whole life. But she knew how to do things." She heard something she hadn't heard before in that kitchen, a short sound, low and quick. She turned. Caleb Thorne was smiling. Barely. A fraction of one. But it was real, and it was there, and it made him look like a different man for the second it lasted. "She sounds like my Uncle Hayes," he said. "Was he competent?" "Terrifyingly," he said. She turned back to the kettle. She was smiling at the stove, and she was glad he couldn't see it. The community, when it found out Daniel had been sick, responded the way small frontier communities respond to illness in a child, with food. Mrs. Grafton arrived on the 4th day with a covered pot of something that smelled like pork and bay leaf, and herbs she grew herself, and behind her came a woman named Clara Pitts from the homestead to the south, who Elara had met once, with a loaf of bread that was still warm. They came inside. They went upstairs to see Daniel, who was by then well enough to be sitting up with his horse and a length of rope that he was attempting to make into a lasso with Will's instruction. They came back downstairs. Clara Pitts sat at the kitchen table with her coat still on and looked at Elara with an expression that was making a genuine effort to be something other than what it had been previously. "You managed it well," she said, like the words cost something, but she was going to pay them. "I had help," Elara said. "Caleb helped?" "Caleb was there every night," she said. Clara Pitts looked at Mrs. Grafton. Mrs. Grafton looked at the pot she'd brought, which was sitting on the stove. "Well," Mrs. Grafton said, which wasn't a sentence, but it was the whole of what she wanted to say. Elara poured them both tea and sat at the table and let the conversation find its own level, which it did, gradually, over the next half hour. Clara Pitts asked about the mustard compress, which Elara explained, and then there was a conversation about fever remedies that got specific and practical in the way women's knowledge gets specific and practical when nobody's performing anything, and by the time they left, something had shifted. Not resolved. The town's opinion of her was not a thing that got resolved in one afternoon, but adjusted. Recalibrated. Clara Pitts, at the door, said, "My Joseph has a cough every winter. If you wouldn't mind, in the spring, showing me that compress." "Of course," Elara said. They left. She stood at the window and watched them go down the drive and thought that this was how belonging worked, if it worked at all. Not through declarations, through mustard poultices and shared knowledge and small adjustments made quietly over time. Will came downstairs while she was watching. "Were they being nice?" he said. There was a suspicion to the question that she recognized. "Getting there," she said. He stood beside her at the window. "Mrs. Pitt said things," he said, "when you first came, about whether it was proper." "I know." "She was wrong." She looked at him sideways. He was looking out the window at the departing figures with the controlled assessment of a boy who had decided something. "Yes," she said. "She was." "She should say so," he said. "She sort of did," Elara said. In her way, Will considered this. People should just say what they mean, he said. She thought about that. Some people can't, she said. Doesn't make the meaning any less real. He thought about that too. Then he went back upstairs. It was the end of the first week of February when Daniel came downstairs for the first time since his illness. He descended with the gravity of a diplomat, one step at a time, the wooden horse in one hand and the railing in the other, and when he arrived at the bottom, he looked around the main room like he'd been gone considerably longer than 10 days. "It's the same," he announced. "What did you expect?" Will said from the table. "I don't know," Daniel said. "Different." He made a tour of the room. He inspected the fire. He went to the window and looked out at the yard, which was still snow-covered and still the same yard it had always been. He turned around. "Elara?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to go see the horses." "When it's warmer," she said. "When?" "A few days." He looked at her with the particular expression of a child who is measuring the distance between a few days and right now, and finding it unreasonably large. "Okay," he said, with magnificent resignation. She watched him settle at the table with his rope and his horse, and felt something in her chest that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely unwelcome. It was the feeling of caring about something you hadn't planned to care about, of having gone and gotten attached when your intention had been to simply get through. She'd been attached since the first morning, she thought, since he'd knocked on her door to tell her it was morning and asked if she liked horses. She just hadn't let herself call it that until now. February brought a slow change in the light. Not warmth, not yet, not by any reasonable measure, but the quality of the days started shifting. The sun got a fraction higher. The afternoons lasted a few minutes longer. It was the kind of change only people who had been watching closely all winter would notice, and she noticed it, and she thought Caleb noticed it too, though he didn't say so. He just seemed to spend a few more minutes in the evenings not looking at his accounts, not doing anything else in particular, just sitting with the lamplight in the main room while the children moved around him. She'd been there 2 months now. The days had their own rhythm. She woke before the house, started the fire and the water, and had the kitchen ready before anyone came down. She managed the children's mornings, Daniel's determined refusal to eat anything that touched anything else on the plate, Nora's quiet efficiency once she was fully awake, Will's morning silences that she'd stopped trying to fill and that he'd stopped seeming to need filled. She managed the house through the days, and in the evenings she was there for whatever the evenings needed. Lessons, mending, the particular unpredictable demands of 3 children at 3 different ages and stages. She was not their mother. She knew that. She was careful about that. But she was something. She was the person who knew which board on the stairs creaked and had showed Daniel how to step over it on his way to the kitchen for a midnight cup of water, and the person who kept Nora's particular thread colors sorted and separate, and the person Will told about problems on the property before he decided whether to tell his father. Not because he was hiding things, but because he needed to say them out loud first, and she'd become the one he said things to first. She hadn't asked to be any of those things. She'd just been there, consistently, and the role had assembled itself around her presence. Caleb was the harder one to understand. He was not closed in the way he'd been in December. The wall was still there. She could feel it, the deliberate space he kept between himself and anything that required vulnerability. But there were gaps in it now, small ones. Moments where he said something real and then seemed faintly surprised by himself. The morning he'd told her about his uncle. The night after Daniel's fever broke when he'd thanked her without looking away. The evening she'd caught him watching her help Daniel with his rope lasso, and he hadn't looked away fast enough to pretend he hadn't been. She didn't push at the gaps. She was afraid of what would happen if she pushed, and he closed the wall back up all the way. She was afraid of what would happen if he didn't. She was sensible enough to notice this fear and clear-eyed enough not to act on it, which took more discipline than she generally liked to admit. It was in the second week of February that she found the letters. She'd been reorganizing the chest in the workroom. She'd been using it for storage, and it had gotten untidy. And under a length of fabric, she found a packet of letters, folded, tied with a ribbon that had faded from what might have been blue to a color that was something between gray and nothing. She knew immediately what they were. She held them for a moment without opening them, and then put them back exactly where she'd found them, and folded the fabric back over them with the same hand she used when she put the bird scissors back in the box. She told Caleb about them that evening. She wasn't sure why she told him, except that not telling him felt like the wrong kind of discretion. He went very still. "I didn't open them," she said. "I know," he said. "I trust you." It was such a simple thing to say, and it landed with such weight that she had to look at the table. "She wrote to her sister in Ohio," he said. He said it like he was saying it to the room, not specifically to her. "Every month. Her sister never came out to see her. Didn't believe in the frontier." A pause. Ruth used to say that was the funniest thing, not believing in the frontier, like it was optional. Something in her chest ached for the woman she'd never met. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Ilara said. "Yes," Caleb said. "She was." Silence for a moment. "The children have her quality," Ilara said. "The way Nora thinks, the way Will takes care of things. Even Daniel, the way he just accepts whatever the situation is and asks you what kind of horse you like." Caleb looked at her. "They're good children," she said, "because of what she built in them." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. She would have... He stopped. She would have been glad someone was here who saw that. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that. She just sat with it and let him sit with it, and the lamp burned between them the way it always did, and outside the February night pressed its cold against the windows. It was 2 days later when everything she'd been building was tested in a way she hadn't seen coming. She'd gotten a letter, carried out by Pete on his supply run, handed to her in the kitchen with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned not to be curious about other people's mail. She'd looked at the handwriting on the outside and known it immediately, because she'd seen it on receipts and ledgers, and the particular cramped penmanship of a man who'd learned to write for function and not for pleasure. Harold Quinn. She set it on the table and looked at it for a full minute before she opened it. He wrote the way he talked, badly and with too much confidence in his own reasonableness. He said he'd been thinking about the arrangement. He said he was glad she was settled, that she must be finding her feet. He said he'd been speaking to some people about the Thorn Ranch, and that he'd heard it was doing well. He said he hoped she was being fairly treated. He said if she ever needed anything, she should know she could write to him. Not one word of apology. Not one acknowledgement of what he'd done or what it had cost her or what it had looked like from her side of the transaction. Just Harold Quinn in his kitchen in Terrence County, writing to his niece in a tone that had already revised the history of what had happened into something he could live with comfortably. She folded the letter. She put it in the chest in her room under the spare blanket. She went back to the kitchen and started supper. Nora found her there, quieter than usual, and Nora was the kind of child who noticed quiet the way other children notice noise. "Are you all right?" Nora said. The question came out awkward, a little stiff. She wasn't used to asking it. You could tell. It was a form of attention she was still learning how to give. "Fine," Ilara said. Nora sat at the table. She picked up the piece of smocking she'd been working on. She'd gotten considerably better in the last few weeks, her stitches tightening up and evening out the way stitches did when you stopped thinking about them and just let your hands do the work. "You got a letter," Nora said. Not a question. "Yes." "Was it bad news?" Ilara looked at her. Nora was looking at her smocking with the focused avoidance of a child who wants information but doesn't want to seem like she's asking for it. "Not exactly," Ilara said. "It was from my uncle. The one who..." She paused, chose carefully. "The one who made this arrangement." Nora was quiet for a moment. "What did he want?" "To check in," Ilara said. The flatness in her voice said the rest. Nora's needle moved through the cloth. "Will doesn't like him," she said. "I mean, he doesn't know him. But Papa told Will how the arrangement was made, and Will didn't like it." Ilara looked at her. "When did your father tell Will that?" "A few weeks ago," Nora said. "After Daniel got sick, I think..." She paused, threading more carefully. "I think Papa felt bad. About how you came here." She didn't know what to do with that. She turned back to the stove. "Ilara," Nora said. "Yes. Are you going to stay?" She kept her hands moving on the pot she was tending. The question was so direct and so young, and so full of a fear the girl wasn't showing on her face. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to stay." Nora didn't say anything else. She went back to her smocking, but after a moment her shoulders came down a fraction from where they'd been. And that was answer enough about what the question had really cost her to ask. Caleb came in from outside an hour later and found the table set and the children doing their work and Alara at the stove. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and stood there for a second, the way he sometimes did in the evenings, like a man confirming something he'd expected but still needed to see. Then he came to the table and sat down. "You got a letter today," he said. She looked at him. "Pete mentioned," he said. He wasn't apologizing for knowing, he was just saying it. "From my uncle," she said. "You don't have to tell me what it said." "I know." She brought the pot to the table. The children settled in. Daniel had been talking to his horse for the last 20 minutes about something to do with the fence along the north pasture, which he'd heard Pete discussing that morning and had absorbed with the comprehensive attention he gave to anything ranch-related. She sat down. Caleb passed the bread to Will without being asked, which was a small automatic thing, and Will passed it down, and the supper began with the ordinary sounds of it, spoons and the fire, and Daniel still quietly narrating something to the wooden horse. Then Caleb said, "I should have said this before, when you arrived." She looked at him. The arrangement with Harold it wasn't. He looked at his plate, then back up. "You were a person, not a transaction. I knew that. I should have made sure you knew I knew it." The table was very quiet. Will was looking at his food with tremendous focus. "You did all right," she said. "I did the minimum," he said. "There's a difference." She couldn't quite argue with that. She also couldn't quite find the words for what she felt, which was something complicated and layered, some residue of the hurt she'd carried since December, and underneath it something much warmer that didn't have a name she was comfortable giving it yet. "We're doing better now," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "We are." Daniel reached across and put his wooden horse on the table next to Alara's plate. "He can sit here," Daniel said. "He likes you best anyway." Will made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had gone a little further. Nora kept her face straight, but her eyes went warm. Caleb was looking at his youngest child with an expression she'd never quite seen on him before. Open, without the careful maintenance behind it. Not just love, though it was that. Something that looked like relief. Like a man who had been afraid for a very long time that the things he loved most would keep being taken from him, and who was, slowly and against his own expectations, starting to believe that they might not be. She looked at the wooden horse standing next to her bowl. She thought, this is what I was building toward. Not the clean house, or the good meals, or the trust of one child, and then another. This moment, at this table, where something that had been broken in 100 different directions was, imperfectly and tentatively, and with all its cracks still showing, being held together. She thought about her uncle's letter under the blanket in her room, about the $40 and the handshake and the cold morning she'd gotten into the wagon. She thought, he could not have known what he was sending me into. She thought, neither did I. The fire in the stove made its sounds. The evening settled around the table. Outside, the February dark came on early the way it always did, and the ridge sat where it had always sat, unmoved by any of this. But inside, something had changed. Not fixed, not resolved. There were miles of hard winter still ahead, and she was not foolish enough to call this an ending of anything. But Daniel's wooden horse was standing next to her plate, and every person at that table had put it there together in their own way, one small, careful thing at a time. That was what she had. She was beginning to understand it was considerable. February gave way to March. The way seasons changed on the frontier, not gently, not with any of the softness that people who'd grown up in milder places expected from the turning of a month. It was more like a negotiation that hadn't fully concluded. The cold retreated by degrees, grudgingly, taking 2 steps back and 1 step forward, and the light came earlier each morning. But the mornings themselves were still hard, still brittle, the ground frozen in the shade long after the sun had been up for hours. But the ranch was alive in a way it hadn't been in December. She noticed it in the particular way you notice a change that happens gradually. Not as a single moment, but as a collection of small ones that you look back on and realize had been accumulating without your awareness. The kitchen had warmth in it that wasn't just from the stove. The children moved through the house with the ordinary, heedless confidence of children who feel safe in a place, which was different from how they'd moved in January, when they'd all been careful in the way of people living inside a held breath. Nora's smocking had gotten genuinely good. She'd moved off practice cloth and onto a piece she was making for real, a cuff for a dress she'd outgrown that she was extending. Will had started telling Alara things without the preliminary silence that used to take up half the conversation. And Daniel had formally declared that she was his second favorite person, clarifying, when she asked who the first was, that it was the horse. She told him that was fair. Caleb was harder to measure because he moved in a different register than his children. Slower to change, more deliberate. The way the ground itself was slower to thaw than the air above it. But she measured him anyway, in the small increments available to her. He asked her opinion now, which he hadn't done in December. Not on everything. Not on the accounts, or the pasture management, or the decisions that were the bones of the ranch, but on the things where the household and the land intersected. Whether Pete's family might benefit from some of the preserved goods she'd been sorting through. Whether the calendar for the spring planting made sense alongside what she'd been planning for the kitchen garden. Small consultations, offered without ceremony. But they meant something, because they represented a man who had decided at some point between December and now that her thinking was worth including. She didn't tell herself it meant more than it did. She tried not to. It was the third week of March when the stampede happened. She would reconstruct it afterward from pieces, from what Pete told her, from what Will described later in the halting way of someone who was still working through the images, from what she could see for herself when she got to the north pasture. It started with a break in the fence along the creek line, the same section Pete had been discussing with the fence posts in February, the one that had been on the list of things to get to before the spring, but hadn't gotten to yet, because the winter had been the kind that pushed everything else aside. Something had gotten at the herd on the other side of the break. A predator, Pete thought, or the smell of one, which amounted to the same thing. And the cattle had moved, not calmly, the way cattle move when something has frightened them down to the marrow, which is not like a river finding its way around a rock, but like water coming through a wall. Will had been on the fence line with Pete. That was the fact she had to hold on to when the rest of it was too much to hold. She'd been in the kitchen when she heard Pete shouting from somewhere out beyond the barn. A particular quality to it. Not his ordinary working voice, but the higher, cracked edge of urgency. She'd been out the door before she'd fully processed what she was hearing, moving across the yard toward the sound, and she'd met Caleb coming from the direction of the south barn at a run, which was a sight she'd never seen before. And the combination of those two things, Pete's voice and Caleb running, told her something was badly wrong before anyone said a word. The north pasture was a quarter-mile from the house. She'd covered it faster than she'd thought her legs could manage. What she found when she got there was the aftermath. The herd had already pushed through and spread, cattle scattered across the far slope, Pete and one of the neighboring hands working to turn them back. The fence line was down in a 40-foot section, posts snapped clean or pulled from the frozen ground, and at the edge of where the fence had been, in the shallow depression where the snow still hadn't fully cleared, Will was on the ground. Caleb got there 2 seconds before she did. He dropped to his knees beside his son. She came down on the other side. Will was conscious. That was the first thing she checked, and the yes of it flooded her with something so intense she had to set it aside immediately because there was work to do. He was conscious, but he was pale in a way that wasn't cold, and his left arm was at an angle that made her stomach drop. And when she put her hand on his shoulder and said his name, he looked at her with eyes that were present but in pain. The flat, steady kind of pain that meant he'd been in it long enough to get used to its shape. "The fence caught me," he said. His voice was controlled in the same way his father's went controlled under pressure. "When they came through, I tried to get clear." "Did you hit your head?" she said. "No." "Are you sure?" "Yes." A pause. "My arm." "I know," she said. "We're going to deal with that." Caleb had Will's other hand in both of his and was doing what she'd seen Caleb do in every crisis. Holding on and holding still, the force of his will translated into the steadiness of his hands. But there was something behind his eyes that she recognized by now, the look that came when fear got past the control layer, the not again. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "He's okay," she said, firm, meeting his eyes directly. "He's conscious. He didn't hit his head, and his arm is broken but not compounding. I need you to help me get him to the house. Can you do that?" He looked at her for one more second. Then whatever was behind his eyes went down, and he was back. Yes, he said. They got Will up between them. He was heavy. He'd grown 3 inches since the fall and hadn't caught up to himself yet, all leg and arm. And he made a sound when they moved the arm that she felt in her back teeth, but he didn't say stop, and she didn't stop. And Caleb moved with her without her having to tell him how, which told her he'd done this before. The particular business of carrying an injured person over uneven ground without making it worse. Pete appeared. He took Will's other side. They got him to the house in 10 minutes. She had him on the kitchen table, because the table was the right height, and because she needed good light, and because this was where she worked and she needed to work, by the time the worst of the shock was hitting him. He'd been riding it on adrenaline, and now the adrenaline was backing off, and the pain was becoming the whole room. "Stay with me," she said. "I'm here," he said through his teeth. "I know you are. I need you to keep talking. Tell me something." "What?" "Anything." A pause. His eyes were closed. His jaw was working. "Daniel asked me this morning if cows know they're cows," Will said. "What did you tell him?" "I said I didn't know. He said he thought they probably didn't. He said that was sad." "He's not wrong," she said. She was working while they talked, checking the arm with her hands, feeling for the break, which was in the forearm, a clean fracture by the way it moved, no displacement she could feel at the surface, which was the best outcome available in a situation that had no good outcomes. She'd set a bone once before with her grandmother's instruction when a neighbor boy had fallen from a hayloft. She knew what she was doing with approximately 70% confidence, which was 70 more than nobody. Caleb stood at the edge of the table. "I need you to hold him still," she said, "from the shoulder. And I need a straight piece of wood and the bandage strips in the medicine chest, top shelf right side." He moved. He came back with both in under a minute. He took Will's shoulder in both hands and braced. "Will," she said. "Yeah," Will said. "This is going to be bad for about 3 seconds," she said. "And then it's going to be better. I need you to hold completely still." He didn't say anything, but she felt him go still under her hands with a deliberateness that was pure will. Not passive, not resigned, but actively chosen. She set the bone. He made a sound she would not describe to anyone. Caleb held. She moved fast and certain through the next 30 seconds. The splint, the wrapping, tight and even. Her hands working from muscle memory and from a very fierce and uncomplicated focus that didn't leave room for anything else. Then it was done. Will's head was back and his breathing was high and fast, and Caleb still had him by the shoulder, and for a moment all 3 of them were just there, in the aftermath of it. "Done," she said. Will looked at the ceiling. His face was a color between white and gray that she'd need to watch. "That," he said very carefully, "was worse than 3 seconds. "Approximately 3, she said. He looked at her. There was something in it. Not gratitude exactly, not in the way you offered gratitude, but the look of a person who had been brought through something and was aware of who had done the bringing. "Thank you," he said. "Rest," she said. She looked up at Caleb. He was staring at her, not in alarm. The alarm had passed. She could see it passing. This was something else. The look of a man who has been surprised by something and is in the process of deciding what to do with the surprise. She looked away. "He needs to stay still and warm for the rest of the day. The bone set clean, but I want to watch the swelling. He shouldn't use it for at least 3 weeks. "All right," Caleb said. "There's willow bark in the dried stores. I'll make a tea for the pain." "All right," he said again. She went to the stove. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were shaking. She hadn't let them shake while she was working, but now they were shaking, and she let them, because this was the order in which those things happened, and she was familiar with the order. She heard Caleb's voice behind her, low, talking to Will, and Will's voice answering, and the sound of the 2 of them having whatever quiet exchange they were having, and she kept her back to it and focused on the task in front of her. By the time she turned around with the tea, Will was on the bench against the wall, propped up, his arm immobilized across his chest, and Caleb was standing beside him with a hand on the boy's head in a gesture so simple and so unguarded that she almost looked away from it. He didn't move the hand when he heard her. He let it stay. She gave Will the tea. She told him what to watch for: increased swelling, color change in the fingers, fever. She told him the same things twice because pain made people forget, and he listened with the disciplined attention of someone who understands he is being given information he needs. Nora and Daniel arrived home from the Grafton place. They'd been there for the morning, an arrangement she'd made earlier in the week, and came through the kitchen door to find their brother on the bench looking like something had happened to him, which something had. Nora stopped in the doorway. Daniel looked at the bandaged arm. He looked at Will's face. He went to the bench and sat down next to Will with a seriousness beyond his years and put his wooden horse on Will's knee. "He can stay with you," Daniel said. "He's good at sitting with people." Will looked at the horse. "Thanks, Dan," he said. His voice was rough. Daniel nodded once, satisfied, and went to find something to eat. Nora was still in the doorway. She was looking at Will with the same careful face she used for everything difficult, the one that was processing more than it was showing. "You're okay," she said. It was halfway between question and statement. "I'm okay," Will said. She crossed the room and sat on his other side. She didn't touch him, didn't say anything else, just put herself there. That was Nora's version of comfort, presence without performance, which Will understood and accepted in the way that people accept things that are given in exactly the form they need. Elara moved through the kitchen, making up a proper meal, because people in shock needed to eat, and people who'd been working since before dawn in freezing temperatures needed to eat, and she had 4 people in her kitchen who qualified on at least one of those counts. Caleb came to stand beside her at the stove, not close, just near. "You set a bone before," he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was just an observation, offered quietly, for her to do whatever she wanted with. "Once," she said. "A neighbor's boy." "How old were you?" 15? He was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother." "She talked me through it," she said. "I was too afraid to start, so she told me the fear was a waste of time and to get on with it." He made a sound, almost the same sound as the one in the kitchen that December morning. Low, brief, real. "I couldn't have done what you did today," he said. "With Will. I couldn't have been that calm." "You were calm," she said. "I was holding on," he said. "That's different." She looked at the pot she was tending. "I've noticed," she said carefully, "that you're very good at holding on, in the way that's more expensive than it looks." He didn't say anything to that right away. She hadn't expected him to. It was the most direct thing she'd said to him about anything that mattered, and she'd set it into the side of his face and to the stove in front of her, which gave both of them a way to let it pass if that's what he wanted. "Yes," he said. "It is." She moved the pot. He stayed where he was. "The fence line," she said, because the work was always there and it mattered. "Pete needs help to repair it before more of the herd pushes through." "I'll get to it tomorrow," he said. "The Garver boys from the settlement might help. Mrs. Grafton mentioned her nephew was looking for work." "I'll ask," he said. Normal sentences, ordinary logistics. But he was still standing beside her at the stove, closer than he usually stood, and neither of them moved away from it. Later that evening, after supper, after Daniel had fallen asleep on the bench and been carried up by Caleb, after Nora had gone up on her own, after Will had been settled with his arm elevated and the willow bark tea repeated, Elara sat at the kitchen table with the mending she'd abandoned that morning. Caleb sat across from her. He didn't have his accounts. He'd brought them to the table and then not opened them. They sat in the quiet that had become comfortable over the last 2 months. Not empty, not pressured, just the ordinary quiet of 2 people occupying the same space without need for noise to fill it. Then Caleb said, "I was afraid today." She kept her hands on the mending. "I know," she said. "Not of losing the cattle," he said. The ranch is not what—" He stopped, tried again. "When I saw Will on the ground, I thought—" "I know," she said. "I thought it too. For about 2 seconds before I started working." He looked at his hands on the table. The particular posture of a man examining something in himself he doesn't entirely know what to do with. "You didn't stop," he said. You went straight to work." "There wasn't time for anything else," she said. "No," he said, "but it's not just that. It's—" He looked up. His eyes were direct in the lamplight, the gray-brown she'd gotten used to reading. "You've been that way since December, straight to what needs doing. I don't think I understood when you came here that someone could be like that a person could walk into a situation this broken and just—" "It's not all broken," she said. "It was," he said. "When you came." She held his gaze. "And now?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. One of his deliberate silences, the kind she'd learned held something real on the other side. "Now it's—" He looked at the kitchen. At the table, the stove, the things she'd rearranged so quietly in January that he'd barely noticed. "It feels like a house again," he said. "I'd forgotten what that felt like." She looked down at the mending in her hands. Her chest felt like something had been pressed against it from the inside. "I'm glad," she said. "Simple?" "True." He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say more and didn't have the architecture for it yet, which she understood. She didn't have the architecture for it either, and she'd been building toward something all winter that she still hadn't named because naming it required a courage she wasn't sure she'd earned. "Will's going to be fine," she said. "He's strong." "He is," Caleb said. "He got that from his mother." "And from his father," she said. He looked at her, not surprised, more like a man finding his footing. "Go to sleep," she said. "You look terrible." Something crossed his face, startled, and then something warmer. "You've said kinder things to the livestock." "The livestock don't argue," she said. He stood up. He gathered his accounts under his arm. He stood there for a moment at the side of the table, looking at her, and she looked back at him. And there was something in the air between them that had been building since December and had gotten bigger after Daniel's fever, and bigger still after today. And she didn't do anything with it, and neither did he, and both of them knew the other one felt it. "Good night, Alara," he said. "Good night, Caleb," she said. He went upstairs. She sat at the table for a while after, in the quiet house, listening to the sounds of the night outside. Wind light for once, cattle settled in the barn, the creak she could hear in March that she hadn't been able to hear in the frozen months. Things were thawing, not just the ground. She thought about where she'd been in December, the wagon coming in through the blizzard, Caleb's unreadable face in the doorway, the children at the bottom of the stairs, herself with a bag she'd packed alone and $40 she'd never seen. She thought about all of it, and she thought about today. Will's face trusting her over the kitchen table, Nora and Daniel on either side of him, Caleb's hand on Will's head without apology. She'd done something here. She couldn't see all the edges of it yet, but she'd done something. She banked the fire. She checked the door. She went through the kitchen one more time in the way she did every night, just to know everything was right. Then she went to her room. She lay down on the quilt that Ruth Thorne had made with small, precise stitches, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought that tomorrow Will would wake up sore and irritable, and she'd need to get broth into him before he decided he was fine, and that the fence line in the north pasture needed attending before the next rain came, and that Daniel had left his rope by the stove and it was going to be a tripping hazard. All the ordinary things. All the things that were hers to know. She thought, this is what it is to belong somewhere, not the comfort of it, the weight of it. The way a place's problems become your problems, not because anyone assigned them to you, but because you've let it matter enough that they do. She'd let this place matter. She'd let these people matter. She'd done it carefully and slowly and without intending to, and there was no undoing it now. And the astonishing thing, the thing she would not have predicted in December, standing in a blizzard in a coat that didn't fit, was that she didn't want to undo it. She wanted to stay. She wanted it not like a resolution, but like a fact, solid, already true. The wind moved outside and the house held against it, the same way it had been holding all winter, the way solid things hold. Not perfectly, not without effort, but because they were built to last, and because what was inside them was worth keeping. She closed her eyes. Spring was coming. She could feel it in the ground even before she could see it in the light. And there was still so much, she thought, so much still to build. Spring came the way it always came to that part of the frontier, not as an arrival, but as a gradual insistence. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving dark, wet earth that smelled like the beginning of things. The creek ran loud with melt. The cattle moved differently, less pressed together, spreading back toward the pasture with a kind of bovine relief that Daniel found enormously entertaining and narrated at length to anyone who would listen. The kitchen garden, which Alara had been planning through February on paper, and in her head, went into the ground in the first week of April with Nora's help, the two of them on their knees in the soft earth, pressing seeds into rows while Daniel walked behind them pretending to supervise. Will's arm healed. It healed slowly and with a great deal of complaint, which was new for Will, who was not ordinarily a complainer. But the arm frustrated him in a specific way. It stood between him and the work he'd been doing since he was 9 years old. The work that was his contribution, his identity, the evidence he offered himself that he was useful. Being unable to do it made him restless and short-tempered in a way that had nothing to do with her and that she understood completely. She found things for him to do one-handed. Accounts. Inventory. Teaching Daniel his letters properly, which Daniel resisted with a creativity that at least kept Will occupied. And in the evenings, she sat with him sometimes and let him talk through what he wanted to do when the arm was right, the fence repairs, the far pasture, the horse he'd been working with Pete that needed more time than anyone had given it this winter. She listened. She asked questions that were real questions, not management. And Will talked, and the talking seemed to help. And somewhere in the 3rd week of his recovery, he stopped being restless and started being patient, which was a different thing and a harder thing. And she was quietly proud of him for finding it. Caleb watched this from the outside. She knew he watched it. She'd gotten good at knowing when he was watching things. The space between them had changed after March. After Will's accident and the night at the kitchen table and the things that had been said and the larger things that had not been said but had been felt clearly by both of them. It was not uncomfortable. That was the strange thing. She'd expected it to become uncomfortable, the way things became uncomfortable when they got to the edge of where they'd been and didn't move either forward or back. But it wasn't. It was more like standing on a threshold where you could feel the warmth of the room ahead, but weren't quite through the door yet, and somehow the threshold itself was okay. Was enough. For now. She didn't push. She had never pushed. That was not how this house operated, and she understood that by now in her bones. What she did do, in April, was write back to her uncle. She'd put it off long enough. The letter had been under the blanket since January, and she'd been deciding what to say to it, which turned out to require the whole intervening time. She sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon when the house was quiet, Caleb out on the property, children at the Grafton place for the afternoon, and wrote carefully, with the same deliberateness she'd have used for anything that needed to be right the first time. She did not say she forgave him. She wasn't there yet, and she wasn't going to pretend she was. She told him she was well. She told him the ranch was a good place. She told him she had made herself useful here. She told him in plain language that was not cruel but was not soft, that she understood now what the arrangement had been, not the version he'd told himself but the actual version, and that she expected him to understand it too. She told him she was not asking for anything except that acknowledgement. She sealed the letter and put it in the outgoing mail with Pete's next supply run. She didn't know if Harold Quinn was capable of the acknowledgement she was asking for. That was his problem to work out. She'd said what was true. That was all she'd ever been able to do. The settlement's opinion of her, meanwhile, had been doing the thing that settled opinions do when they are confronted repeatedly with contrary evidence. It was changing. Slowly. Without anyone admitting that change was happening. Clara Pitts had come in March to learn the mustard compress as she'd asked, and had brought her daughter, and they'd spent an afternoon in the kitchen and left with a warmth toward Alara that was genuine, if unpracticed. Mrs. Grafton had progressed from her initial investigative visits to something that resembled actual friendship. She still had opinions about everything and expressed them with the subtlety of a fence post, but now her opinions included the observation that Alara Quinn was a sensible woman and that the Thorne household had not been in better shape since Ruth was alive, which was Mrs. Grafton's version of high praise, and everyone who knew her understood it as such. The supply town when she went in April with Caleb was different from January. People spoke to her directly. The man who ran the dry goods asked after the children by name. A woman she'd never met approached her to ask about the kitchen garden, and they had a 10-minute conversation about seed varieties that felt entirely normal, which was, she realized afterward, remarkable. She didn't belong yet. That was the wrong word for it. Belonging was something you grew into over years, not months, and she'd been here since December. But she was becoming recognized, known. And on the frontier, being known was the first step toward belonging, because nobody had the time or the inclination to accept a stranger, but a person who had been through a hard winter alongside you and was still standing. That was someone you could start to trust. Caleb said very little during the drive back from town that April afternoon. She sat beside him on the wagon bench with the supply list in her lap and the warm light of an April afternoon making the ridge look different from how it had looked all winter, less like a wall, more like a frame. "People are talking differently about you," he said. "I noticed," she said. "Clara Pitts asked me if you were planning to stay," he said. She looked at her hands on the supply list. "What did you tell her?" A pause. His hands on the reins, easy, familiar. "I said I hoped so." She looked at him. He was looking at the road. "That's what you told her?" she said. "Yes," he said. She looked back at the road too. "That's a careful answer," she said. "I'm a careful man," he said. She thought about that for a moment. "I know," she said. The horse moved, the wheels on the road, the afternoon light doing what April light does, making everything look like a version of itself that could last. "Alara?" he said. "Yes." He was quiet for another moment, the long kind. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I should tell you that first. It's been a long time since I had to figure out how to say something like this, and I'm aware that I'm not doing it gracefully." She waited. "You came here in December as an arrangement," he said. "I want you to know that's not what this is anymore. For me. If it's only that for you I understand it, and I won't—" He stopped. Started again. "But if it's not only that, if any part of this place has become something to you, I'd want to know that." She looked at the road for a long moment. Then she said, "I told Nora in February that I was going to stay." He looked at her. "Not because I was obligated to," she said. "Because I wanted to. Because I'd gotten attached to a 5-year-old who gave me his wooden horse to make me feel better, and a 12-year-old who told me about a loose stovepipe because it was the only kindness he knew how to offer, and a girl who let me braid her hair and didn't say thank you and meant it more than most people mean anything." She paused. "And because this house started to feel like mine, the kitchen, the garden, the quilt I've been sleeping under, all of it." He was watching her. "And you," she said, quieter. "Because of you too." The horse kept moving. The road ran on ahead of them, curving around the base of the ridge toward home. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand. Not with ceremony, not with announcement. Just his hand finding hers on top of the supply list and holding. She looked straight ahead. Her heart was doing something she wasn't going to try to describe. He held her hand until the ranch came into view, and then he let go to take the reins with both hands, and when they pulled into the yard and Pete came to take the horse, Caleb climbed down and then turned and offered his hand to help her down, which he had never done before. And she took it, and he held it for a second longer than necessary after her feet were on the ground. Pete, to his infinite credit, looked at the horse and said nothing. May arrived with a particular clarity to the air that she hadn't experienced anywhere else, high and clean, and carrying the smell of things growing from a long way off. The kitchen garden was coming in. She'd put in more than she'd planned, because she'd found herself thinking in terms of the winter ahead instead of just the season she was in, which was a form of thinking that told her something about how she'd located herself in time. Will's arm came out of its splint in the second week of May. He spent approximately 6 hours being careful with it, and then spent the rest of the day doing everything he'd been told not to do for 8 weeks, at the end of which it was sore but functional, and the expression on his face when he came in for supper, tested and whole and deeply satisfied, was one she thought she'd remember for a very long time. She was at the stove when he came in. He stood in the kitchen and rolled his shoulder experimentally and said, "It held." "I know," she said. "I said it right." He looked at her, and then, in the most Will Thorne way possible, he said, "Yes, you did," and sat down for supper. That was Will's thank you. She'd learned to receive it. The evening Caleb asked her, it was late May, and it came in a field. He'd asked her to walk with him to check the south pasture fence after supper, which was a practical errand and also transparently not only a practical errand, and she'd gone with him in the long evening light that May gave you, the kind that stretched the afternoon out into something golden and unhurried. The fence was fine. They both knew it was fine before they looked at it. On the way back, they stopped at the edge of the field where the winter wheat was coming in. and beyond it, the wildflowers that grew at the margin of the cultivated ground. Not a dramatic display, nothing arranged, just the ordinary frontier growth that showed up every spring whether you wanted it or not. Yellow and white and a small precise blue that she didn't know the name of. Ruth Thorne had planted some of them, she knew. She'd learned that from Nora, who'd mentioned it once in passing, the way Nora mentioned things she was still deciding how to hold. She stood at the edge of the field and felt the evening air and thought about December. The blizzard, the cold, the shape of a man in a doorway who hadn't looked at her face when he'd agreed to take her. "I need to say something," Caleb said. She turned. He was standing a few feet away, and he had his hat in his hands, which she'd noticed over the months was what he did when he was going to say something that mattered and wanted his hands occupied. He looked like a man who had been working up to this for long enough that working up to it had itself become exhausting. "Say it," she said. "I'm not," he exhaled. "I've been thinking about how to do this correctly, and I don't think there is a correctly. I think there's just," he looked at her. "I want to ask you to marry me. I want to ask you to build this with me. The ranch, the children, all of it. Not as an arrangement, not as the thing Harold Quinn set up, as," he stopped, "as what it actually is, which is that I love you, which I understand is a complicated thing to say given how this started, and I know you didn't come here for that, and if it's too much or too soon, I'm prepared to wait however long." "Caleb," she said. Stopped. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "Stop talking." Something happened in his face that she'd never seen before. A complete unguarding, top to bottom, the whole careful structure he maintained just coming down for a moment, showing her the man underneath it, who was not composed and not controlled, and who was, she realized with a sharp ache of tenderness, profoundly relieved. He crossed the distance between them. He held her face in both hands, his hat somewhere in the grass, and he kissed her in the evening light at the edge of a field that smelled like wheat and old wildflowers, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart going fast under her palms and thought, there it is. There's what's been behind the wall. It was not a perfect moment. Her hair was escaping its braid and she had dirt on her sleeve from the garden and he was rough-shaved and smelled like a day's work. The wildflowers behind her were half weeds and the fence in the far corner still had a section that needed attention. It was the realest moment she'd ever stood in. They told the children that evening. She'd worried about this more than she'd worried about the conversation in the field. The field had only required honesty. The kitchen table required navigating 3 children at 3 different stages of understanding, each with their own relationship to what a change like this meant. Caleb sat at the head of the table. She sat across from where she always sat. The children were ranged between them, Daniel with his horse, Nora with her hands flat on the table, Will looking at his father with that careful assessment he'd never lost. Caleb told them plainly. He said he'd asked Alara to marry him, and she'd said yes. Silence. Daniel looked at Alara. "Does that mean you're staying?" he said. "Yes," she said. "That's what it means." He picked up his horse and held it out to her. "You can have him," he said, "for keeps." Her throat did something she was not going to allow to interfere. "I'll borrow him," she said. "He should live with you." Daniel considered this negotiation and accepted it. Nora was looking at the table. Her hands were still flat on it, the way she held herself when she was absorbing something. Alara watched her and waited. Then Nora looked up. Her eyes were bright in a way she was working to control. "You're not replacing her," she said. It wasn't accusatory. It was a statement that needed to be true, and she was checking. "No," Alara said. "I'm not. I know that. I'm not trying to." "You're something else," Nora said. "Yes," Alara said. "Something else." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, with a gravity that was entirely her own, and looked back at the table, which was Nora's way of saying that was the right answer and this could proceed. Will had been quiet through all of it. He was looking at his father with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Caleb met his son's eyes and held them. "Well?" Caleb said. Will was quiet for one more second. Then he said, "It's about time." And that was all he said. But coming from Will, with the weight of everything that lived behind his silences, the year of holding things together, The grief he'd carried and the guilt he'd almost buried himself under and the long, careful winter of deciding whether to trust someone new, it was more than enough. It was everything. They married in June. Not a large ceremony. The frontier didn't have patience for large ceremonies, and neither did she. Mrs. Grafton came and cried, which surprised everyone, including Mrs. Grafton. Clara Pitts came with her daughter. Pete stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, looking like a man performing the act of attending a wedding, which was the closest he got to emotion. The settlement's people came, most of them, and the ones who'd spoken unkindly in January spoke warmly in June, and she received their warmth with the same steadiness she'd received everything, without drama, without the score settling that would have been satisfying and useless in equal measure. She did not invite Harold Quinn. She'd gotten his letter in May. He'd written back finally, and in it he'd done something she hadn't expected. He'd tried. It was awkward and self-serving and not entirely honest, and it was also a genuine attempt at acknowledgement, which she recognized because she knew how much it must have cost him, and she gave him credit for the attempt even while she noted its limitations. She'd written back. She told him where and when the wedding would be. She hadn't expected him to come. He came. She saw him from across the yard. Her Uncle Harold. Smaller than she remembered somehow, or maybe she was just seeing him differently now that she had ground under her feet and people beside her who knew her name. He was standing at the edge of the gathering with his hat in his hands and an expression that was the most uncomfortable she'd ever seen on his face, which was saying something. She went to him. She could have not gone. She'd thought about that. She could have let him stand at the edge and make of it what he would. But she'd done enough with hard feelings over the winter to know that the ones you didn't deal with didn't dissolve. They just went underground. "Uncle Harold," she said. He looked at her. He looked at the house behind her, the yard, the children somewhere in the noise of the gathering. She could hear Daniel explaining something to someone at volume. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. He looked at her again. She let him look. She'd learned patience this winter, real patience, the kind that comes from having built something you believe in, not the patience of someone who has no other option. "I'm sorry," he said. He said it the way people say things that cost them, quickly, without eye contact, already bracing for the response. She stood with it for a moment. "I know," she said. Not "I forgive you." Not "it's fine, it all worked out." Just "I know," which was true, and which was what she could give him. He nodded. He looked down at his hat. "She's made something here, Harold." It was Caleb behind her. She hadn't heard him come up. He stood beside her and looked at her uncle with an expression that was even and unhurried. "She made something out of what you set in motion, and I want you to understand that she did it herself. Not because of the arrangement, despite it." Harold Quinn looked at his niece's husband and then at his niece. "I see that," he said. "I do see it." She thought he meant it. She thought he was a small man who had done a wrong thing and was going to have to live with knowing it, and that the living with it was probably sufficient punishment without her adding to it. She let him stay for the gathering. She did not make him feel at home, but she let him stay. Summer on the ranch was a different world from winter. The work didn't stop. It never stopped. That was the basic fact of frontier life that nobody who'd only read about it understood. But it changed its quality. The cattle spread across the good pasture. The kitchen garden came in so well she was putting things up for winter by July. Nora got fast enough at smocking that she started teaching Daniel, who was not good at it, but who applied himself with the same concentration he gave to everything he decided to care about. Will worked the far pasture with Pete and came in burned brown by the sun, growing still, broader through the shoulder, becoming the man she could already see him turning into, capable and careful and, increasingly, given to a dry humor that she suspected he'd been keeping under wraps all winter. She and Caleb were not a smooth couple. She'd have been suspicious if they were. They disagreed about the kitchen garden fence, which he thought should be moved and she thought should be reinforced in place. They disagreed about whether Daniel needed more structure in his lessons, which she thought yes, and he thought eventually. He had a tendency to make decisions before consulting her on things that affected both of them, which she called out once, directly, in a conversation that was not comfortable for either of them, and that ended with him acknowledging she was right, and her acknowledging she'd said it more sharply than necessary. That conversation made things better. Not immediately. Immediately it made things tense. But after the tension cleared, something was more honest between them, more settled. They had the shape of two people who dealt with each other rather than around each other. She loved him for that, for being willing to deal with her rather than manage her. In September, she understood that she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge alone for a few days, not from fear and not from hesitation, but because she wanted to understand what she felt before she said it out loud. What she felt, she found, was something very simple and very large. A continuation. A thread that ran forward from here into a future she hadn't been able to see in December, when she'd arrived with a bag she'd packed alone and $40, and the very small hope that she might be able to make herself useful somewhere. She told Caleb on a September evening after the children were in bed. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he put his face in his hands the way she'd seen him do once before, in Daniel's sick room in January, and she waited. When he looked up, his eyes were wet in the corners, which she'd never seen. And he didn't apologize for it, which she'd have expected him to. "Okay," he said. His voice was rough. "Okay," she said. "I don't have a better word for it," he said. He exhaled. "I'm very glad." "Good," she said. "So am I." He reached across the table and took her hand, the same way he'd taken it on the wagon in April, without ceremony, just his hand finding hers. Will found out the next morning. He was coming in from the barn when Caleb told him, and he stood in the doorway with mud on his boots processing the information with his face, going through 3 or 4 things before it landed. "Huh," he said. "Is that it?" Caleb said. "I need a minute," Will said. He went to the barn and came back in 20 minutes and sat down for breakfast and said, to no one in particular, "I already know how to look after a baby, so that's fine." Nora, who had been told separately by Alara in the kitchen over the bird scissors sewing box, had cried. Just briefly, just for a minute, and then she'd stopped and looked at Alara with eyes that were red at the rims and said, "I'm not sad. I don't know why I'm crying." "It's a lot," Alara said. "Yes," Nora said. "But it's good." "Yes," Alara said. "It is." Daniel's reaction was immediate and total. He announced that the baby should be named Horse. When this was gently declined, he offered Horseman as a compromise. When this was also declined, he went away to think about it and came back 3 days later with Harold, which he'd heard recently and liked the sound of, and which caused a moment of very interesting silence at the supper table before Alara said that Harold was a fine name, and Caleb agreed and Will looked at the ceiling. The winter came back. It always did. That was the frontier's most fundamental fact. The seasons turned and the cold returned, and you could not stop it, and there was nothing to do but be ready for it. She was ready. She had a kitchen that was hers and a garden put up for the cold months, and a house that she knew in the way you know a place after you've scraped and cleaned and mended every part of it. She had 3 children who had started as strangers and had become not hers in a way that canceled anything before her, but hers in the way that things become yours when you choose them and they choose you back. She had a husband who was difficult in the specific ways that honest people are difficult, who said what he meant and meant what he said, who had loved one woman well and was learning to love another differently and without apology. She had herself. That was the thing she kept coming back to. She had walked into this place with nothing but herself. No guarantee, no protection, no certainty that she would be treated as a person rather than a solution, and she had held on to herself through the whole of it. She had not become smaller or quieter or more convenient. She had just been exactly what she was, consistently, and it had turned out that was enough. More than enough. Her uncle had sold her for $40. She had built a life worth considerably more than that, by measures that didn't have a number. The first snow of the new winter came in November, earlier than last year, coming in hard off the ridge the way it always did, the way it would do every year for as long as she lived here. She stood at the kitchen window in the morning and watched it come. Daniel appeared at her elbow. He was 6 now, taller than she'd realized, the baby roundness going out of his face and something more definite coming in to replace it. He stood beside her with his wooden horse and looked at the snow. "Same as when you came," he said. "Almost," she said. "But different," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the snow with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has already learned that weather doesn't negotiate. Yes, she said. Different. He leaned against her side. She put her arm around him. Through the window, the snow came down over the yard, over the barn, over the kitchen garden where the last of the year's work was already under the ground, waiting. Behind her, the house was waking up. She could hear Will on the stairs, Nora's door, Caleb's footstep crossing the room above. The sounds she knew the way she knew her own breathing. The sounds of a life. She thought about this girl who'd ridden into this storm in December, 18 years old, in a coat that didn't fit, heading toward a doorway, and a man who hadn't looked at her face. She thought, I'd tell her to stay. Not because it was easy, not because it was fair, but because the things worth having rarely come through easy and fair, and because the measure of a life is not the condition in which you arrived, but what you built after your hands found the ground. She had found the ground. She had built. And in the spring, when the thaw came again, there would be a child in this house who would never know a winter without her, who would grow up knowing exactly what the kitchen smelled like, and which step on the stairs creaked, and where the bird scissors lived in the sewing box. All the small, exact knowledge that is the texture of belonging, the proof that you were here, that you stayed, that you mattered. That was the legacy. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that got written down in ledgers or announced in town squares. The quiet kind. The kind that lived in people. The snow kept coming. She turned from the window and went to start the fire. There was breakfast to make. There were people in this house who were going to be hungry. She got to work.